Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking far past, the usual automotive surface. We are getting into the story of Alpina automobiles and, well, the very specific social idea they came to represent. This is really not just about fast cars. It's about the sociology of status in 1980s Europe. We've taken all the sources you share, the economic histories, the cultural write-ups, all the technical specs, and we've tried to distill them into one key mission. And that mission is to understand why a high-performance car that was designed to not draw attention, why that became the ultimate status symbol for a certain kind of successful professional European buyer. Why was this idea of quiet confidence so much more valuable than, just being flashy?
It's such a fascinating question because it forces us to connect economics directly to psychology. I mean, Alpina was the choice of people who could afford literally anything, anything at all, and yet they chose discretion. So to understand that choice, you have to dig into the deep cultural and economic context that made that kind of visual restraint not just appealing, but almost a requirement for success in that time and place.
Okay, let's get into section one then. What did Europe actually feel like during this period?
Yeah.
Because the sources, they paint a very clear picture. Yes, there was prosperity, but it was sort of layered over this deep, lingering sense of economic anxiety
Yeah.
and social prudence.
That underlying anxiety is absolutely the key. The sources really stress how formative the 1970s were, specifically the oil crises, 1973 and 1979. These were not just market blips, they were culture-changing events. They reintroduced this idea of resource vulnerability that a lot of people in post-war Europe had, frankly, forgotten about.
You mean things like the lasting psychological impact of the petrol queues, the driving bans on Sundays, that feeling of national uncertainty?
Exactly. Families who remembered waiting hours just to fill up their car, or, the days when whole industries just ground to a halt. That memory of scarcity, it stuck around for decades. And it fundamentally changed how even prosperous people viewed conspicuous consumption. Especially when it came to thirsty cars, a car couldn't just be fast anymore. It had to be seen as responsible.
And this is where that concept the sources talk about comes in. Moral signaling. It wasn't just about the price of fuel, was it?
Oh, not at all. The sources make it clear that moral signaling meant that efficiency itself became a kind of ethical position. In that environment, driving a huge, loud, thirsty car didn't just say you were wealthy, it started to communicate a kind of perceived greed, maybe irresponsibility, especially to your neighbors or your employees who are still struggling with inflation. The whole consumer mindset had shifted. If you were truly competent, you managed your resources wisely, full stop.
And you look at the late 70s, early 80s, inflation had just hammered people's savings. Wage growth was lagging. So a big purchase like a high-end car was under intense scrutiny, not just from the bank, but from your peers.
That level of scrutiny is precisely why the aesthetics mattered so much. If you chose a car that was too flashy, it could easily be read as a sign of bad judgment, a lack of financial prudence. But if you invested in something subtle, something refined, you were signaling control, mastery, long-term thinking. And this idea justifying the expense by demonstrating competence, that is the foundation Alpina built its entire business on.
Okay, so against this whole backdrop of prudence and anxiety, we have the standard bearer for German engineering. BMW, they had very successfully cornered the market on engineering credibility, precision, and especially that long-distance competence. I mean, you're talking about the E28.5 series, the legendary executive saloon, that beautiful E24 6 Series coupe. These were tools for professionals.
And that heritage of precision is key. BMW built its reputation on being a builder of sophisticated instruments. But when they formalized their motorsport division, BMW M, the strategy sort of tilted. It became much more about outward projection.
The M cars, which, to be fair, were brilliant. But they really embraced that motorsport theater.
They did. The sources call them loud in every sense, and you can see it in the design. The aggressive body kits, the flared wheel arches, which were often needed for racing rules, the big spoilers, bright colors. They were amazing machines, but they came with this narrative that just demanded immediate attention, immediate applause. They were basically engineered to shout performance pedigree on the street.
And that shout was perfect for a certain buyer, right? The younger, maybe newly wealthy person who wanted that instant recognition. But the sources point to this other powerful group, the established professionals, the industrialists, people with old money who actively rejected that style.
That is the pivot point. For that established executive class, the M car, for all its engineering genius, was just too much theater. It felt a little desperate,
Yeah.
too eager to announce its own success. This was a group that had the money for the absolute best performance, but they had zero appetite for the visible ego trip that came with the standard M look.
But wait a minute, if M was providing this incredible factory-backed performance, wasn't it the more straightforward choice? Why would you go to a separate tuning house like Alpina? Isn't that just conspicuous consumption hiding behind a veil of competence?
That's a great question, and the answer is all in the engineering focus. M's focus was often on peak horsepower, on track day stiffness, things they needed for their racing programs. Alpina's focus was totally different. It was about real-world performance for a conservative, high-mileage professional. Alpina slipped into that gap because they offered a solution engineered for utility and proficiency, not for competition.
So let's detail that solution. They weren't selling a dream, they were selling a highly optimized tool. How did their engineering actually reflect that refinement over rhetoric idea?
Right, so we have to get a little technical here. Alpina focused intently on usable mid-range torque. That's what you need for effortless passing at very high speeds. Think 140, 150 kilometers per hour on the Autobahn, where you need to accelerate without the car violently downshifting. And to get that, they didn't just tweak the software. They often rebuilt parts of the engine from the ground up. We're talking about bespoke components, special high-compression Molle pistons, redesigned intake manifolds for better airflow, new cam profiles designed for a broad, flat torque curve, not a spiky peak near the red line. This was all internal, invisible mastery.
So you're saying the real performance was baked into the engine internals and the gearing. It wasn't just bolted onto the outside.
Precisely. And the chassis tells the exact same story. Where M was focused on making the suspension stiffer for the track, Alpina was focused on sophisticated damping, on spring rates that gave you incredible high-speed stability and comfort over, a 5-hour drive. The interior was the same. Bespoke luxury, unique leather, that signature wood trim. It was about creating a refined, comfortable office, not a racing cockpit.
So that technical difference performance you felt effortlessly at 140 kilometers versus performance that made a lot of noise pulling away from a light at 40 kilometers that connects the function directly back to that cultural idea of competence.
It absolutely does. An Alpina owner wasn't buying the fastest car from 0 to 60. They were buying the most proficient long-distance tool available. They were buying mastery of the machine, which reflected their own professional mastery. It said, I have engineered my car just as I've engineered my business, for efficiency, for durability, and for sustained high-speed competence without any fuss or drama. It was performance for the Autobahn, not the pit lane.
Okay, so this brings us to the core of it all, the social commentary. Why choose the subtle Alpina stripe over the instantly recognizable and very expensive M badge? What did that whisper really communicate in that social environment?
This is where we have to look at the context of conservative European wealth, especially in the 80s. Old money, particularly in places like Germany and Switzerland, viewed overt displays of wealth with deep, deep suspicion. The consensus was, you don't announce your success, you hide it.
Why? Why the need to hide it?
Discretion was a form of self-protection. On multiple levels. If you were too flashy, you attracted unwanted attention. And the sources are clear. This meant attention from critical neighbors questioning your values, from tax authorities who might start scrutinizing your business, and yes, even from organized crime, who saw loud, expensive cars as very easy targets.
Ah.
By choosing an Alpina, you were just minimizing your risk profile. You were adhering to a cultural code that valued prudence and, frankly, low visibility.
So the car became less of a statement about how much money you had and more a statement about how well you managed it and how well you understood the unspoken rules.
Precisely. The visual choice was a demonstration of good judgment. If you drove the M, everyone on the street knew you were rich. If you drove the Alpina, only the people who mattered knew you were discerningly rich. And that is a huge difference in that hierarchy.
That creates this fascinating social filter then. Alpina was using its aesthetic, that subtle pinstripe, those iconic multi-spoke wheels, almost like a secret handshake.
That's the perfect analogy. The M car was recognized by everybody. The Alpina was recognized by the right people, the people who noticed the decals, who knew the unique interiors, who understood what those engine changes really meant. Those were your peers, your competitors, your potential business partners. They were exactly the people whose opinions actually carried weight in that world.
So when an industrialist or a top lawyer chose, say, an Alpina B7 Turbo over the latest M car, they weren't sacrificing performance. They were making a very strategic statement about who they were, and maybe more importantly, who they weren't.
They were choosing to embody quiet confidence. They were showing that they didn't need validation from strangers on the street. Their success was built on mastery and discretion. And in that specific socioeconomic moment in 1980s Europe, that choice signaled that you were a player who understood the real rules of the game. You knew your own value, and you let your proficiency do the talking, not your exhaust note. Culturally, that was the most powerful signal you could send.
The Alpina story, then, it really boils down to this powerful illustration of how external economic pressures and these deep social norms, how they dictate what becomes a symbol of power. It shows us that true strength isn't always in the size of the badge or the volume of the exhaust. It's in the cultivated art of discretion. Status isn't always about shouting. Sometimes it's about that curated, informed privacy, the secret handshake of success.
And that idea is timeless. I mean, if this deep dive shows that calculated understatement was power back in the 1980s, it raises a really interesting question for you, the listener. What areas of consumption or technology or culture today are still governed by this need for quiet confidence instead of overt noise? Where is discretion still the true sign of insider knowledge and power in our world? Maybe it's the unmarked private jet or a specific choice of subtle high-performance tech. Something to think about the next time you see something profoundly subtle that costs way more than its flashy alternative.